Do you feel a creeping, shrinking sensation, Watson, when you stand before the serpents in the zoo and see the slithering, gliding, venomous creatures with their deadly eyes and wicked, flattened faces? Well, that's how Milverton impresses me. Hello everybody, I'm Kate Cast, and welcome to another edition of Let's Talk About, and welcome to the latest installment of Sherlock and the Curious Critic. With fun reunions and celebrations had, Season 3 will come to a close, testing those bonds more than ever in His Last Vow. The detective and doctor that have faced some of the most dangerous criminals in England now cross paths with the master blackmailer, who holds secrets that not only threaten the integrity of some of the most powerful people in the country, but the heroes we know and love. Much like John and Mary's wedding and actually processing Sherlock's return from the grave, His Last Vow takes something from the original stories that isn't often adapted and expands on it to fit into this universe and challenge these incarnations of the characters. In this case, it's the proper introduction of our Season 3 villain, Charles Augustus Magnuson, played by Lars Mikkelsen. Yeah, this guy is from one of the stories, but they changed his last name. I have no idea why. Just when you thought Moriarty was as slimy as the criminal class gets, they give us this bespectacled lizard man. Magnuson is another highly intelligent opponent whose main drive is that he's a blackmailer, gathering sensitive information on influential people, so he holds a sort of power over them. Able to control people in a sense, out of fear he'll expose their secrets for their retaliation against his deplorable actions. Unlike Moriarty, who was more of a shadowy presence that few people knew about, Magnuson is a public figure, and just the mention of this guy's name seems to unnerve the most stoic of people. Even Sherlock, who found the most dangerous criminal London has ever known fascinating, is utterly repulsed by this man and what he does. You really see Magnuson's power when he meets with the boys at Baker Street, where he has complete control of a situation that is built to do the exact opposite. Not just because it's Sherlock's home turf, but with the way the scene is laid out. Sherlock and John are standing over him in a way that should feel dominating, while Magnuson is lounging there taking full command of the conversation. It's really unsettling. Every second of Magnuson's screen time feels disturbing, making you feel bad for anyone who has to share a room with this man who preys on people's weaknesses and regrets, and doesn't seem to have any regard for personal space.
The whole world is wet to my touch.
Yeah, you know, like the skin of a snake. On that note, mad props to Mikkelsen. None of this would come across without his performance, and I feel like this incarnation of the character really came alive once he was cast. I don't envy anyone who had to follow Moriarty, but boy did he slither in and bring the creep back to the show. But even with Magnuson entering the picture and presenting very high stakes for the episode, as we'll see, they still managed to find time for some fun exchanges. There are quite a few one-line, laugh-out-loud moments in this one. Great bits of dialogue and confrontation between the characters that always makes me chuckle in between the intense moments without clashing with the more dramatic events. The highlight likely being the moment where it's revealed that Sherlock is going out with Janine. Yeah, remember her from the last episode? They're a thing now, and much like John standing there witnessing this, many audience members also felt like they had to reboot their brains to figure out what the hell was going on here. We'll come back to the what of all of this in a minute, but I really love how this whole revelation is presented, with Sherlock trying to talk about his case against Magnuson, while John is just too stuck on the idea that Sherlock has a girlfriend to talk about anything else.
Seriously? I've just told you that the Western world is run from this house, and you want to talk about dinner?
Fine, talk about the house.
Like I said, the dramatic and comedic pair with each other. Makes for great entertainment. Although, with how much this show likes digging ideas out of lightly explored concepts from the original stories, I'm shocked they never explain how Sherlock can still live comfortably at Baker Street without John helping him pay the rent. I guess that's just something else it has in common with the source material. Speaking of which, since there are quite a few to go over this time, let's jump right into talking about the book-related callbacks in our segment. You might think the character that inspired Magnuson was from the story this episode takes its title from, His Last Vow, but no. Milverton's story is fairly easy to find because it's called The Adventure of Charles Augustus Milverton. A lot of Magnuson's characteristics are similar to Milverton, mainly his untouchable yet deplorable confidence. His estate is called Appledore, just like in the story, and events like Sherlock meeting the blackmailer at Baker Street on behalf of a client, and his and John's attempted break-ins are all plot points from that story. So what's here from His Last Vow? Really? Not much at all. His Last Vow is this odd epilogue to The Great Detective about Holmes' service as a spy in World War I or something, being the last story not in publication, but in continuity. While His Last Vow bears no resemblance to it story-wise, there are still a couple of nods. As far as I remember, this is the first published story that mentions Holmes retiring in Sussex to raise bees. Something that is mentioned in this episode, but it's Janine who gets the cottage. Still a cute reference though. And at the end of the episode, Sherlock mentions the east wind, a force that destroys anything in its path, referencing the last, most famous, and best lines from His Last Vow. Now that's cleared up, onto some other story mentions. Sherlock calls Magnuson the Napoleon of blackmail, which is a rework of his title for Moriarty, the Napoleon of crime. I always thought they didn't use it for Moriarty because it felt out of place in the 2010s, but I guess they changed their minds. A subplot at the beginning of the episode sees John going to get a neighbor from a drug den and finding Sherlock there undercover. This is straight from the opening of The Man with the Twisted Lip, and the first time Sherlock's history with drugs is front and center. I mean, it's been mentioned before, but not this blatantly. Motley even reprimands him for doing this by repurposing a line of Watson's from The Sign of Four.
How dare you throw away the beautiful gifts you were born with?
And I like that they gave that moment to Molly. Certainly makes up for them breaking off her engagement for reasons. Yeah, we never find out why. I guess the writers just didn't want her to be happy. During the whole drug den debacle, we're introduced to Billy Wiggins, played by Tom Brooke, a character who is sort of a combination of two child assistants Holmes had in the stories, but now he's grown up. And a junkie. But he shows some solid observation skills, and during the rest of the episode, Sherlock takes him on as a sort of apprentice. At one point, Sherlock mentions that John has put on a few pounds since he got married, which is a comment Holmes made towards his friend in A Scandal in Bohemia.
So have you got out of the house, John? You've put on 7 pounds since you got married and the cycling isn't doing it.
It's actually 4 pounds.
Mary and I think 7.
And later on, he quotes himself from the Naval Treaty, where he says he could never resist a touch of the dramatic. A line spoken while he has arranged a meeting at what are essentially empty houses, which is a neat way to include a name drop for the story, The Empty House. Plus, these houses where they only have a front facade at Leinster Gardens are a real thing, which makes them an even cooler idea to incorporate in my opinion. When we get to see Sherlock's parents again, it's brought up that Mrs. Holmes used to be a mathematician. This I felt was worth mentioning because it might play into this ancient fan theory that Holmes' mother knew Moriarty, who was a mathematician in the original stories. They clearly aren't hinting at anything like that in Sherlock, but I think it's a fun reminder that even 100-odd years ago, fans still like to speculate. And finally, a reference that ties back to the strange goings-on between Sherlock and Janine, where Sherlock proposes to Janine. Why? Because she's Magnuson's assistant. This is a really infamous plot point from Charles Augustus Milverton's story that I had somehow completely forgotten about when I saw this episode for the first time until he pulled the ring out. Otherwise, I'm sure this whole arrangement would have been way clearer, way quicker. Something I really wish I'd brought up in my Scandal in Belgravia review was not quite understanding why people thought what Sherlock did to Irene was so vicious. She had done nothing but deceive him. He had no reason to feel anything towards her, even if she did. But this was pretty deplorable, even for Sherlock. But in true Sherlock fashion, the case comes first. And on the other hand, in the original story, the engagement was not only purely for information, much like it is here, but never plays into the story from that point on in a meaningful way. The girl is never even properly in the story. Here, Janine gets her payback for how Sherlock used her, and they manage to find some kind of compromise while not really repairing their relationship in any way. Obviously, it was never going to be romantic, but I really like the addition of Janine lamenting that they could have been friends, which is fair. Sherlock may have gotten her to help him without the lies, but sadly we'll never know. It's hardly the sole focus of the episode, but it's nice how much time they do dedicate to it, especially the aftermath. But as dramatic as all that is, it is nothing compared to the biggest twist of season 3.
Twist!
Mary Mary is an assassin. And just in case anyone's confused, we are done with the left from the pages section. This is once again not a book thing. This is a Sherlock exclusive reveal. This is awesome. And bad. It's bad. Very bad. In the span of a minute, we are forced to process that Mary has some secret identity going on, which Magnuson obviously found out about and blackmailed her with, which is why she's here, and watch her shoot Sherlock before she leaves. But thankfully, they do take the time to remind us that this was kind of foreshadowed. Her cleverness, her skills, the fact that she's the only girl John ever dated who remotely liked Sherlock. And if you go back to the empty hearse, you can see the word liar flash by as Sherlock is deducing things about Mary. And while you can tell Sherlock has his suspicions in the beginning, a twitch here, a glance there, he never acts on them because he liked her and she made John happy. And that got him a hole in his belly. Guess that's what Karen gets you. Well, at least we get this pretty intense and creative sequence of the inside of Sherlock's mind palace as he tries to survive this bullet. The direction of this episode is pretty mellow compared to the rest of the show, but that might be because they blew most of the creativity budget on this sequence. They are really indulging in the surreal visual direction here, and for the most part it works. But there are still some things worth noting, like the fact that just because our main character might be dying doesn't mean we don't have time for a crazy cameo. Wow, I didn't think it was possible for this version of Moriarty to be more unhinged, but this episode is just full of surprises. Once again, kudos to Scott's performance because it is just, like more than usual. Also deep in Sherlock's mind palace is Redbeard. Yeah, okay, so this is once again not from the books, but has been a thing on Sherlock for a little while. Mycroft briefly mentioned it in the last episode, and Magnuson notices it as one of Sherlock's many pressure points. And I probably should have brought this up before, because it's kind of important, but I didn't. Sorry. This is where we find out that Redbeard was a dog. Sherlock's childhood dog, apparently. Okay. Now, for the record, this is not the last we'll hear about Redbeard. Not by a long shot. There is more to this story, but this was meant to be a pretty important reveal, and it personally left me feeling like,
what the hell was that?
Also, hi Stephen Moffat's son. He plays the younger Sherlock at points in this episode, and it's pretty good casting. He looks a lot like him. They are just loving the family casting this season. Generally, this whole sequence has a lot of intense, creative, and impressive moments. It's just a shame that it goes on forever. Seriously, this sequence is almost 10 minutes long. 10 minutes! That might seem like peanuts when we have a feature-length runtime to work with, but you really start to feel it towards the end of the whole ordeal, and kind of starts to lose the severity of the situation in my eyes. I realize Sherlock is fighting for his life here, but sheesh, get to the point. Actually, that's kind of the biggest issue with this episode in my eyes. The pace is weird. The first half hour is good, it was solid progression, the introductions are great, and the build-up to Mary's reveal is astounding with a triple perfume red herring, but once the reveal happens, it galvanizes the entire second act. Yeah, it's important for us to explore the implications here and sort everything out with someone who has become such an important character, but in the process, our main villain kind of becomes irrelevant, or at the very least, his presence isn't felt in the story that much. Nobody really talks about him, and we don't properly see him again until the last 20 minutes in this restaurant scene, which is kinda weird. This looks ridiculous, right? Like, it's not just me. And that on its own wouldn't be a problem after all the other two villains of the season weren't even revealed properly until the end of their stories, but with Magnuson, someone who should be pulling the strings and manipulating the actions of those around him in fear of being exposed, for such a large threat, there should still be a sense of dread throughout these events all connected to him. Even if he is just sitting on the sidelines, it should still feel like he's in control, you know? Like in the Reichenbach Fall, where even when Moriarty wasn't on screen, you could feel him pulling the strings of every twist and turn. With that said, season 3 has mostly been about spending more time with the characters, so this does line up with the overall direction of the season to see that take such a dramatic turn, but it's the first episode where I feel like the 90-minute runtime hurts the episode rather than helps it. It somehow has a lot to do, but the pace of events can sometimes drag. But while I do wish there was a bit more of a balance the events of this section of the episode, what they do focus on here is very captivating. Paying off investment in this new dynamic by putting it through its greatest obstacle yet and seeing if things will work out or if this was all destined to fail. This whole confrontation is already off to a great start just with the setup, with Sherlock luring Mary into confessing right in front of John at the empty house. It has a really cool twist on a reference from the empty house of Holmes using a dummy to fool an adversary, finding a great way to fake out the book fans, and Abington's performance is one of her best in the series. Without saying anything, it really feels like her whole world is crashing down in front of her. Sherlock orchestrated all of this so John knows the truth straight from the source and tries to sort it out before more damage can be done. Now, this whole conversation encompasses a lot, but one of the biggest things is related to John. Season 2 of Sherlock had several moments connected to the larger mysteries that tested Sherlock Holmes as a character, and in my eyes, the same can very easily be said about John in Season 3. While I spend a good chunk of these videos talking about Sherlock, the major changes in the season have all been connected to John. The empty hearse revolved around John's actions surrounding Sherlock's fake death, the sign of 3 was of course all about John's wedding, and His Last Vow shows what John means to these dysfunctional people he surrounds himself with, and what that says about him. That he's an adrenaline junkie. He gets a thrill and finds purpose in exciting and dangerous escapades, which is kind of an interesting take on the character. Why, even as the normal one, John finds Sherlock and his work fascinating in a way most people don't. This revelation only shows just how much they are kindred spirits. Sherlock risks his life to prove he's clever, and John risks his life for a similar sense of excitement and maybe even validation. And this isn't new. This is something the show's been hinting at since day one.
You're not haunted by the war, Dr. Watson. You miss it.
Strangely, this whole confrontation is framed as sort of an intervention, which at first I thought was weird if they wanted to keep John involved in the adventures, but when you get down to it, it's not about getting John to stop being that way, it's about accepting a part of himself that he's been denying is there. After all, the instances that are connected to this behavior of his have been some of my favorite parts of this incarnation of Watson, showing how much he's able to hold his own and put up a fight as a soldier, which we get a reminder of earlier in the drug den, being more defensive for Sherlock and towards him. Those extra bits of Watson's rougher edges that so often get sanded down. While they might be a bit edgier here, it's another instance of Sherlock taking a great book character and exploring them deeper to discover new depth and understanding. And this scenario is about doing that for John. But John remains angry because Mary was supposed to be different, a more stable and reliable anchor in his life after losing the riskier side of it for 2 years. And even though John craves excitement, it makes sense why he'd want someone more normal after Sherlock's supposed death, and still want it as a sort of balance when Sherlock came back. So far, that's what it's been, and it's been great. But things change, and John had to really see himself before he could see Mary for who she was. So, in a great setup, they decide to treat Mary like a client, hear her story and her side of it all, and decide if they'll help her or let her go. Listening to Mary while she tells what she's willing to about her past, and how much she wanted to move on and build a life with John, explaining how Mary is still a character worth our care as an audience because she cares so much about John. So much so that she didn't kill Sherlock. Yes, she shot him, which is a bit not good, but as an agent for hire, it's clear that if Mary wanted to kill Sherlock, he'd be dead. They take the time to show that Mary went to elaborate lengths to keep her cover, but in a way that wouldn't hurt John. After all, she saw how much Sherlock's death could hurt him already. If Mary didn't care about John or Sherlock, she could have finished the job she was there to do and disappeared. This of course doesn't excuse her shooting her friend, but it shows how much Mary wasn't willing to lose them. Now just to be clear, John has every right to be pissed off, especially since this is the second time this season he's been lied to severely by someone he cared about. But in my eyes, he also has no right to play high and mighty about Mary's actions, Mr. I killed a man for my potential roommate. I'm just saying. So, after hearing the whole story, and after months of deliberation, John is able to decide what direction to take, what path to walk down after another instance of feeling betrayed. And that path is the one with the crazy people by his side, willing to not dwell on who Mary was and accept her for who she is. Solidified by one of my favorite lines from John in the entire series.
The problems of your past are your business. The problems of your future and my privilege.
If memory serves, this whole realization surrounding Mary was a controversial move with fans, making her an assassin and being willing to forgive her for the lying and the shooting. But to me, it not only makes Mary much more interesting, but strengthens her relationship with John and makes John come to terms with something about himself and what to do about it. It's a conflict that benefits both of them as characters on their own and as a couple. They could have very easily used this reveal as an excuse to make Mary a double agent or morally irredeemable so they could boot her from the series, putting John and Mary's relationship in a place it could never come back from. Instead, they let Mary's dilemma be portrayed as sympathetic and let Sherlock, of all people, guide them to figure out what they are and what they can be. I appreciate that. I feel like I should also mention that this eventual reconciliation occurs at Sherlock's parents' house during Christmas. Christmas at the Holmes household was something I never thought I needed so bad in my life, but it is delightful. It's great to see Sherlock's parents again, and it gives us my favorite scene with Sherlock and Mycroft in the whole show.
Are you two smoking?
No.
But in case you forgot, we've still got a master blackmailer out there, and now the family issues are sorted out, it's about time to take care of that. Now, of course, there were attempts to stop Magnuson before this. Sherlock tried to take control of the situation by tricking Magnuson into blackmailing him. That didn't work. Sherlock went to his office to recover the information. We all know how well that went. Sherlock suspects he's being fed the information through his glasses, which was my working theory at the time too, but that turns out to be wrong. But I thought it was cool that they used Milverton's most memorable feature as a fake-out. So this time, Sherlock heads into the Dragon's Den to trick Magnuson again, where first we find out that Magnuson was responsible for the bonfire incident back in the empty hearse, to use John as leverage for Sherlock, which didn't work. Even though he wouldn't have been severely hurt and didn't let them know he was responsible, so what was the plan there again? I'm willing to admit I'm missing something there, but this was kind of a weak payoff to that whole ordeal. What is a much stronger payoff is Magnuson's final and most damning trump card. The reveal of the Appledore vaults are not a massive traceable archive, but that all that life-threatening information is confined to Magnuson's mind palace. I remember that when I saw this reveal for the first time, I thought it was a major cop-out that didn't really add up, that he didn't really have proof for his claims that threatened so many people's lives, so where's his power? What's his hold over these people? Only later did I realize that knowing those compromising things is enough for most. There's also a line that says he knows where to acquire proof when it's needed. But it's not just this knowledge about people getting out that's a threat. Magnuson goes a step further by saying he knows people who would want to hurt Mary because of her past. Being able to threaten not just people's reputations, but their safety and even their lives. All of this only adds to his vile intentions, belittling and extorting others for his own sick pleasure, using a high intelligence technique like the Mind Palace to destroy people's lives for his own gain. He's smart enough to not just find and remember all this stuff about people, but keep it all together in one place where it can't be found or traced, just knowing enough to ruin someone's life, including John and Mary's. Backed into a corner after multiple failures to take this reprehensible man down, Sherlock only sees one way to destroy the Appledore vaults for good.
A high-functioning sociopath. Merry Christmas!
This was quite possibly the most controversial move in the episode. Some people really weren't fond of the solution from Sherlock to just kill Magnuson to stop him. Now, I do get the sentiment that Sherlock should have found a more clever solution to this problem. He's a superhero of the brain. He doesn't just gun down his problems. But the fact that it came to that just adds to Magnuson's magnitude. Unlike Moriarty, who had a massive web under his fingers, there was no real way to trace Magnuson's deeds to charge him with any kind of crime. Sherlock tried several times over the course of this episode, even while he was standing in Appledore, and each time Magnuson had an out. Nobody could touch him, no matter how hard they tried. Even if it lacks elegance, this seemed like the only way to really stop him. And technically speaking, this was his fate in the original story, except there he was killed by some random woman he was blackmailing. While I don't agree with Moffat and Gatiss' speculation that Holmes did this in the the original story as well, and Watson just altered the narrative, I still see using Sherlock's first and only time he directly kills someone on the show as a solid way of resolving this matter. The only other thing I could think of to stop Magnuson is maybe to have Sherlock find something to blackmail him with. The old taste of your own medicine tactic. But that might still leave them at the same impasse. Please, if anyone knows of a way Sherlock could have outsmarted him into giving his scheme up with the evidence the episode presents, share. And I don't mean by rewriting like half the episode, I mean at that point, once it was revealed what Appledore was, what could have been changed? Sherlock is not just taking down a man he personally despises for using similar remarkable powers of intelligence to take advantage of people for his own gain, but he also, once again, sacrificed himself by doing this to keep John and Mary out of it. So Magnuson can never hurt anyone ever again, especially the two people closest to him.
Give my love to Mary. Tell her she's safe now.
It may be the most extreme act Sherlock commits in the entire series, but his reasoning for why he does it kinda shows that extra bit of sentiment that he's been more willing to show throughout season 3, and was put through the ultimate test in His Last Vow. It has its inhibiting moments, such as not seeing Mary for what she was sooner, and acting a bit too quickly with Magnuson to protect her and John, but there's also the side of Sherlock going to greater lengths for the ones he cares about. He risks his health, and even his life to arrange it so Mary and John can patch things up properly. He invites them over for Christmas, and he even joins his parents for Christmas, which I'm willing to bet it's been quite some time since that happened, viewing Magnuson as despicable for taking advantage of people like he does, and of course, the action he takes towards Magnuson to keep him from hurting John and Mary further. His Last Vow feels like it presents some of the dangers that comes with caring about people that Sherlock and Mycroft tend to voice. It runs the risk of coming with betrayal, heartbreak, and others taking advantage of those connections. But it also shows that, to Sherlock at least, it's worth the risk, as long as he can stand between the people he cares about and those willing to hurt them, even if it means being sent away on a suicide mission where he'll never see them again. Well, at least this time John and Sherlock get something resembling a proper goodbye, before he's immediately sent back home. It's still Sherlock doing what he's always done, running after the bad guys for the thrill of it, but I think if season 3 showed anything, it's that it's not just to prove he's clever anymore. There's more noble purpose to it now, even if it didn't go the way anyone expected. Overall, wait, am I forgetting something?
Miss me? Did you 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 miss me?
Alright, Moriarty's back. Maybe. Don't worry, we'll talk about that in a future episode, but for now, overall, His Last Vow is probably the bumpiest season finale yet. It took a lot of risks that, depending on who you ask, were either exciting and intriguing, or a sign that the show was losing its touch. I'm somewhere in the middle. It has a lot of interesting ideas and conflicts that sync up with the arc of season 3 rather nicely, but it does have trouble balancing all out from time to time, with some sequences being drawn out way too long, and sometimes making it feel like you're flipping through the channels watching two separate episodes. There's also the start of hinting at future plot points that also feels like it's fighting for your attention in an already crowded episode.
Not given to outbursts of brotherly compassion. You know what happened to the other one.
But while those issues mean it has trouble standing next to the likes of The Reichenbach Fall or The Great Game, the strengths of this episode still outnumber its weaknesses. They found a great way to portray Magnuson's unsettling business and personality. The changes to Mary as a character continue to make her much more interesting in my eyes. The stakes still feel high in a way that is quite compelling, and the performances continue to shine no matter what the episode demands of these actors. His Last Vow is an episode that I feel struggled under its own weight, but I admire how hard they tried to hold it high above their heads. But next time, we'll be heading back to a simpler yet just as mysterious time in the special Christmas episode in October, The Abominable Bride. Thanks for watching, and I will see you guys next time.